I sat in court, silently expecting to be committed until my lawyer played one video that made my father freeze, my brother's smirk die, and my mother turn paper, white on the spot, revealing the trap I hid in plain sight. Humidity clung to the wood paneling of the Savannah probate office like a second skin. Benedict sat across from me, his surgical posture perfect. He spoke of my instability with a voice like polished marble. My parents wept into silk. They looked like grieving aristocrats, not executioners. The war started 3 months ago, when my grandfather's will shattered the polite family veneer. We gathered in the library, a room smelling of old leather and generational secrets. The lawyer read the news with a dry, rhythmic voice. Benedict leaned forward, expecting the $15 million estate to fund his mounting gambling debts. Instead, the old man left everything to me. Slept. I was the quiet artist who lived in the carriage house and smelled of turpentine. My parents didn't celebrate. They watched me with a terrifying, predatory intensity. My mother, Genevieve, cornered me near the velvet sofas the next morning. She dried her eyes instantly and demanded I sell the property to save Benedict from his bookies. I looked at her and finally saw the invisible chain. I was never a daughter, I was a utility. I was the scapegoat they used to absorb Benedict's darkness. I told them no. I announced that the house would become a sanctuary for abused women. Benedict's laugh was cold and sharp. He promised I would regret choosing strangers over blood. 3 days later, I found the knife in my studio. The air smelled of metallic iron and spilled oil. My grandfather's portrait had been flayed, the canvas hanging in ribbons like flayed skin. Benedict stepped from the shadows, his lab coat impeccable, but his eyes dead. He told the police I was spiraling and dangerous. I watched the blue lights flash against the cadmium, red paint on the walls. I chose to go gray. I swallowed my scream and offered the officers my wrists. Silence was my only weapon. The psychiatric hold was a study in endurance. They took my shoelaces and my phone, leaving me under buzzing fluorescent lights. I treated the cell as a waiting room, answering every question with terrifying clarity. When my parents arrived, later with a casserole and fake tears, I knew the performance was for a new audience. They begged me to attend a reconciliation dinner. Genevieve claimed they were cutting Benedict out of the trust. I spotted the forgery in her timing. I nodded and accepted. Traps only work if you are unaware. The dining room felt like a Gothic fortress of dark wood and heavy silver. Benedict sat in his usual place, unrepentant and calm. My father poured the wine, but the scent was wrong. It smelled of sweet, nutty almond rather than Bordeaux. I faked a sip and let my body go slack. They whispered about the notary and the power of attorney as I lay there. They never noticed the diamond brooch on my chest. Behind the vintage stone, a high-definition lens recorded their confession. My family finally looked at me with honest fear. The camera lens captured every word of their conspiracy. Benedict leaned over the table, his face twisted with a greedy impatience. He checked his watch, noting the time it took for the sedative to take hold. My father beckoned the notary from the shadows of the hallway. They believed I was a hollow shell, drugged and defeated. My mother reached out to stroke my hair, but her touch felt like a spider. She whispered about the family legacy. The trap was fully shut. The notary placed the legal documents on the polished mahogany surface. He was a small man with nervous eyes who didn't look at me. Benedict gripped my hand, trying to force a pen between my limp fingers. He needed my signature to liquidate the estate and erase his debts. I kept my breathing shallow and my eyes half closed. The smell of the bitter almond wine lingered on the air. My father urged the man to hurry. They were reckless now. "She's ready," Benedict muttered, his voice cold and clinical. He began to guide my hand toward the signature line. My mother watched with a hungry focus, her silk dress rustling in the stifling silence. I felt the cold metal of the pen against my skin. This was the moment they threw away their souls for $15 million. They didn't see the tiny red light blinking on my brooch. I remained a stone. They were writing their own prison sentences. I let out a soft, staged groan to stall their progress. Benedict hissed at me to be still. He was losing his composure, the mask of the brilliant surgeon finally slipping. He called me a burden and a waste of space. My father didn't defend me. He only paced the room, worried about the clock. They discussed the psychiatric facility they had chosen for my permanent stay. It was a private place where voices were easily buried. The cruelty was absolute. Suddenly, a loud knock echoed through the heavy oak front doors. My father froze, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. Benedict dropped the pen, and it rolled across the mahogany. We weren't expecting company. The notary began to gather his things with trembling hands. He knew this wasn't a standard signing. My mother moved toward the window to peek through the heavy drapes. The blue and red lights were back. They weren't here for me. The police didn't wait for an invitation this time. They entered with a firm authority that filled the oppressive room. My lawyer followed close behind, holding a tablet and looking directly at my brooch. I sat up straight, the fake lethargy vanishing instantly. Benedict gasped, his eyes darting toward the back exit. He realized the sedative hadn't worked. He realized I had been watching them the entire time. The silence in the room was heavy. My lawyer pressed play. The recording filled the dining hall with their own treacherous voices. Every admission of the framing and the drugging played back in high definition. The judge was already reviewing the live feed from his home office. Benedict tried to scream that it was a fake, but the evidence was undeniable. My father slumped into his chair, looking aged and broken. My mother just stared at the camera lens in my jewelry. I finally stood up. I was the architect now. Benedict lunged for the tablet, but an officer stepped between them. The golden child was finally losing his grip on reality. He ranted about deep fakes and digital manipulation. His voice cracked, losing its clinical edge. My father remained motionless, staring at the spilled wine on the white tablecloth. The stain looked like a map of their failure. My mother reached for her pearls, a habit from a life spent hiding the truth. The room felt cold and vast. The officers began to read them their rights. The words felt like iron bars snapping into place. Benedict looked at me with a hatred that could burn through stone. He realized his surgical career was over before the first handcuff clicked. I didn't feel the joy I expected. I only felt a strange, hollow relief. The notary was already being led away to a separate cruiser. He was talking fast, eager to trade their secrets for his freedom. My lawyer, Sarah, handed me a glass of plain water. I drank it slowly, washing away the metallic ghost of the sedative. She whispered that the judge had issued an emergency injunction. The estate was safe, and my family's access to the trust was frozen. Benedict began to scream as they pulled him toward the door. He called me a traitor to the name. I looked at him and felt nothing. He was just a man with debts. The house grew quiet as the sirens faded into the savannah night. I walked through the dark hallways of the main estate alone. Every shadow seemed to hold a memory of a lie. I stopped at the library where it all began. The smell of old leather was still there, but the rot was gone. I touched the heavy desk where my grandfather had signed the will. He knew this would happen. He gave me a cage to destroy. I spent the next hour gathering the files Benedict had hidden. I found the bank statements and the gambling tallies in a false bottom drawer. He had lost more than just money. He had sold family heirlooms to pay off men in Atlantic City. The scale of his desperation was staggering. He had been planning to commit me since the day of the funeral. I held the papers and felt the weight of his envy. It was a heavy burden. The morning light began to bleed through the heavy curtains. I walked out to the carriage house to check on my damaged art. The slashed portrait of my grandfather sat on the easel, a ruin of canvas and red paint. I didn't feel like fixing it anymore. I saw the beauty in the scars. It was a record of the war I had won. I picked up a brush, but I didn't paint. I simply sat in the morning silence. A car pulled into the gravel driveway, breaking my peace. It wasn't the police or my lawyer. A woman stepped out, looking bruised and carrying a small suitcase. She said she had heard about the sanctuary through the grapevine. I realized the news of my victory had already traveled. The work was starting sooner than I expected. I stood up and opened the door for her. My family was gone, but the house was finally becoming a home. I guided the woman toward the sunlit kitchen of the carriage house. Her eyes were wide, taking in the splattered, red paint on the studio walls. She flinched at the sight of the ruined portrait on the easel. I realized then that my sanctuary was still a crime scene. I needed to scrub the rot away before I could help anyone else. We sat in silence as the kettle began to whistle. The sound was sharp and piercing. Sarah called an hour later with news from the county jail. My father had suffered a minor heart event during the booking process. The guilt was a physical weight he couldn't carry. Benedict, however, remained defiant behind bars. He was already trying to blame the notary for the drugging incident. He claimed I had staged the entire dinner to frame them. His arrogance was a terminal disease. I felt a cold chill settle in my bones. The woman, whose name was Elena, touched the scarred canvas of the grandfather portrait. She asked if I was going to throw it away. I looked at the jagged ribbons of fabric and the dried paint. It looked like a map of survival. I told her the scars were the most important part of the story. She nodded slowly, her hand trembling. We started cleaning the studio together. It was the first act of our new life. By noon, the smell of turpentine and lemon oil filled the air. We scrubbed the cadmium red from the floorboards until our hands were raw. Every stroke felt like a prayer for a different future. I found a hidden compartment in the back of the easel. Inside was a small, hand-drawn map of the estate grounds. My grandfather had marked a spot under the old willow tree. It was a secret he never shared. I grabbed a shovel and walked out into the humid afternoon heat. The willow tree stood like a silent sentinel at the edge of the property. I began to dig through the soft, dark earth. The roots were thick and stubborn. After 20 minutes, the blade hit something solid and metallic. It was a heavy lockbox wrapped in thick, oiled leather. My heart hammered against my ribs. I wondered what else the old man had kept from us. I carried the box back to the kitchen table. Elena watched with curiosity as I forced the rusted latch open. Inside were stacks of letters addressed to my mother. They weren't love letters from my father. They were records of a secret debt she had hidden for decades. She hadn't been trying to save Benedict's name. She was trying to hide her own shadow. The family legacy was a lie built on top of another lie. The final letter was dated just days before my grandfather died. He warned my mother that he knew everything. He told her that giving the house to me was her only chance at redemption. She had chosen to destroy me, instead of facing her truth. I looked at the papers and realized the war wasn't over. There was one more secret that could burn everything down. I heard a car door slam in the driveway. It was starting again. I pushed the lockbox aside and stood up. Through the kitchen window, I saw a sleek black sedan idling near the willow tree. A man in a tailored suit stepped out, holding a briefcase like a weapon. He didn't look like the police or a debt collector. He looked like the kind of person who erased problems for a living. Elena retreated into the shadows of the studio, her breath hitching. I gripped the edge of the table. The man didn't knock. He pushed the door open with a quiet, practiced ease. He introduced himself as the executor of a secondary trust I never knew existed. My grandfather had divided the fortune into two distinct layers. The 15 million was just the surface. This man represented the hidden foundation of the Vance family wealth. He placed a single key on the table next to the letters. It was made of heavy, tarnished brass. The air grew cold. "Your brother knows about this," the man said. His voice was a flat, mechanical monotone. Benedict hadn't been gambling away his own future. He had been trying to buy his way into this second, deeper inheritance. The debt letters in the lockbox were just the entry fee to a much darker game. My mother wasn't protecting Benedict's reputation. She was protecting the source of the money. I realized the estate was a front for something older. The executor explained that the key opened a vault beneath the Savannah courthouse. My grandfather had spent 50 years documenting every bribe and every shadow in this city. It wasn't an art collection, it was a ledger of control. If I accepted the inheritance, I became the keeper of those secrets. If I refused, the entire fortune would revert to Benedict upon his release. The choice was a jagged blade. I looked at the key. I asked why Benedict was still a threat while behind bars. The man smiled thinly, revealing teeth that were too white and too straight. Benedict had friends in the local government who were mentioned in that vault. They wouldn't let him sit in a cell for long if he could offer them their own destruction. My victory in the courtroom was a temporary illusion. The walls were closing in again. I felt the weight of the brass key. Elena emerged from the studio, her face set in a mask of determination. She told me we couldn't let the golden child win. She had seen the rot firsthand in her own life, and wouldn't watch it happen again. I looked at the letters from my grandfather once more. He hadn't left me a gift, he had left me a duty. I picked up the brass key and felt its cold, heavy truth. I had to see the vault. We reached the courthouse as the sun began to dip below the horizon. The building was a monument to old Southern justice and hidden agendas. The executor led us down a flight of stone stairs into the basement. The air smelled of damp limestone and ancient paper. He pointed to a small door at the end of the corridor. I inserted the key and turned it. The sound of the lock clicking echoed like a gunshot. The door opened. The vault door groaned on rusted hinges as it swung open. The air inside was thick with the scent of mothballs and decay. Rows of gray filing cabinets stretched into the darkness like tombstones. I stepped inside, the brass key still warm in my palm. This was the true engine of the Vance family. It was not a treasury of gold or jewels. It was a library of human weakness and political debt. My grandfather had recorded everything with cold, meticulous precision. I opened the top drawer of the nearest cabinet and pulled a file. It contained a ledger detailing years of illicit payments to local judges and city council members. Benedict's name appeared in the margins of several documents from a decade ago. He had been a predator in training, long before his gambling debts surfaced. Slept. The records showed how our parents covered up his early mistakes with the family's hidden influence. Every clean image they maintained was bought with this filthy paper. The executor stood in the doorway, his silhouette sharp against the hallway light. He told me that my choice would define the future of the city. If I burned the vault, the power structure would collapse. If I kept it, I would become the person I hated most. I looked at the names on the folders and felt a wave of nausea. These people were the pillars of our community. They were also puppets dancing on grandfather's old strings. Alina walked to the center of the room and touched a heavy iron safe. She asked what was hidden deeper than the ledgers. I used the key on the smaller inner lock with a trembling hand. Inside sat a series of high-quality cassette tapes and a small portable player. My grandfather had not just written down the truth. He had recorded the actual voices of the men who ruled Savannah. The subtext of their whispers was unmistakable. It was pure, unadulterated blackmail. I pressed play on the first tape I found in the stack. A familiar voice filled the cramped room with a chilling, clinical tone. It was Benedict, but he sounded younger and much more confident. He was discussing a patient who had died on his operating table. He wasn't mourning the loss of a life or a career. He was negotiating the price for a falsified autopsy report. My mother's voice joined the recording, offering the family's full support. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the chest. Benedict had not been framed by life or bad luck. He was a monster created by the very people who claimed to love me. They had used the vault to keep him out of prison for years. I looked at the executor and asked why he was showing me this now. He admitted that the previous keeper had died under suspicious circumstances. This inheritance was a target painted on my back. The building suddenly echoed with the sound of heavy footsteps on the stairs above us. The executor checked his watch and swore under his breath. We were not supposed to be here after the sun had fully set. Benedict's allies had been alerted to the vault's opening by a silent alarm. The power in the basement flickered and then died completely. We were trapped in the dark with 50 years of secrets. I gripped the heavy brass key tightly. I grabbed the tape player and shoved the specific cassette into my pocket. Elena found a heavy metal flashlight in the corner of the room. Its beam cut through the dust, illuminating the exit door. We had to move before the men reached the basement level. Slept. The executor whispered that there was an old service tunnel leading to the street. It was narrow and filled with stagnant water. I didn't care about the filth. I only wanted out. We scrambled into the crawlspace, just as the vault door was kicked open. I heard voices shouting for the files and the tapes. They sounded frantic and desperate to protect their own reputations. We crawled through the damp darkness, my heart hammering against my ribs. The smell of the sewer was overwhelming. But I didn't stop. I felt the weight of the tape against my thigh. It was the only weapon I had left to use. We emerged into a back alley 3 blocks away from the courthouse. The cool night air felt like a blessing on my skin. Alina was covered in soot, but her eyes were burning with a new fire. She asked me what our next move would be. I looked at the black sedan parked at the end of the alley. The local police, deep in the pockets of the vault's names, had processed his bail in record time. He wasn't in jail. He was waiting for me. Benedict sat behind the tinted glass, like a king on a temporary throne. He looked pristine. his medical degree apparently serving as a shield against the consequences of his crimes. He rolled down the window, the mechanical hum sounding like a predator's purr. He didn't look like a man who had just escaped a cell. He looked like a man who owned the night. I realized then that my legal victory had been a mere speed bump for his allies. He wanted the tape. "You always were too stubborn for your own good, Dean," he said. His voice was steady and lacked the frantic edge from the dining room. He offered me a seat in the plush leather interior as if we were friends. Elena gripped my arm, her fingernails digging into my skin. I could feel the cold weight of the cassette tape against my leg. It was the only thing keeping us alive in this alley. He knew I had found the inner safe. I refused the seat and stood my ground on the damp pavement. I told him the vault was empty, and the records were gone. He laughed, a sound that lacked any genuine warmth or humor. He pointed to the courthouse basement where smoke was beginning to billow from the vents. They were burning the evidence to protect the men in power. The ledgers were ash, but he knew about the recording. He needed the physical proof of his malpractice, destroyed forever. The driver of the sedan stepped out, resting a hand on his holster. The threat was silent, but absolute in the dim light of the alley. Benedict offered a trade that sounded almost reasonable. He would leave the estate alone if I handed over the tape. He claimed. Our mother was waiting for us at the house with the final papers. It was another performance, another layer of his practiced deceit. I looked at the smoke rising behind him. I reached into my pocket and felt the plastic casing of the cassette. I didn't pull it out. Instead, I asked him, "What about the patient mentioned in the autopsy report?" His face finally twitched, a small fracture in his surgical mask of calm. He didn't expect me to have listened to it so quickly. The subtext of his silence confirmed every horror I had suspected. He wasn't just a gambler. He was a killer who used a scalpel. "The truth won't bring anyone back," Benedict whispered, leaning closer to the window. He reminded me that the men who protected him still ran the city. If I released the tape, I would be hunted until the end of my days. He was offering me a life of quiet art and sanctuary. All I had to do was remain the silent brother he needed. I looked at Alina and saw the bruises on her face. I chose my side. I pulled the tape from my pocket and held it over a storm drain. Benedict's eyes widened, and he made a move to open the door. I told him that I had already uploaded the audio to a cloud server. It was a lie, but it was a necessary one. The driver froze, uncertain of his next move. The power balance shifted in the cold air of the alley. I wasn't the prey anymore. I was the one holding the match. Benedict snarled and ordered the driver to take the tape by force. I didn't flinch as the man stepped toward me with a grim expression. I held my phone up, showing a live stream to my lawyer's office. The subtext was clear. If I fell, the world would hear his confession. The driver hesitated, looking back at his employer for new instructions. Benedict looked a cornered animal. He realized his surgical precision had failed him this time. The sound of more sirens began to fill the streets around us. Anticipating the local corruption, my lawyer had called the federal authorities to bypass the local police Benedict controlled. The sedan's tires screeched as Benedict ordered the driver to flee. They disappeared into the night, leaving a trail of exhaust and broken promises. I stood in the alley, trembling with a sudden, violent adrenaline. We were safe for the moment, but the war had reached a new level. I still had the tape. We walked toward my lawyer's car as the first federal units arrived. Sarah looked at me with a mix of pride and profound worry. she said. The recording was enough to bring down the entire city council. I handed her the cassette and felt the final weight lift. The sanctuary was no longer just a dream for others. It was the only place I could truly exist. Then, I saw the text message on my phone. My mother was gone. Bless slept. The message from my father was a single, shattered sentence. Genevieve had fled the estate as the federal sirens neared the property lines. She didn't leave a note or a destination, only an empty jewelry box. I realized she wasn't just hiding from the law. She was running from the truth I held in my pocket. The family legacy had finally dissolved into a frantic flight. I looked at the dark Savannah skyline and felt the weight of the end. It was over. We arrived at the main house under a canopy of oak trees. Federal agents moved through the library, like ghosts in tactical gear. My father sat on the velvet sofa, looking like a man made of ash. He didn't ask about the tape or the vault. He only stared at the spot where my mother used to stand. The silence was heavier than the humid night air. He handed me a small, sealed envelope. It was addressed to me in her perfect, flowing script. I opened the letter with trembling fingers. She admitted that Benedict wasn't the only one she was protecting. The secret debts belonged to her father, the man I called a hero. My grandfather, his brother, hadn't been collector of beauty. He was a master of leverage who had spent a lifetime cleaning up the family's messes. Every painting in the house was a payment for a silence crime. I looked at the walls and saw a gallery of blood. The sanctuary was built on a foundation of bones. I felt a sudden sharp nausea. The money is gone, Dean, my father whispered. He explained Aviv had liquidated the secondary trust before the freeze took effect. She had left us with the house, but none of the wealth. Benedict's gamble wasn't just with cards, it was with our survival. We were aristocrats with empty pockets and a mountain of federal charges. I looked at Alina and saw her face fall. The dream of the sanctuary was fading into a legal nightmare. We were alone. But then Sarah reminded me that the primary estate, though stripped of cash, was legally mine and worth a fortune on the open market as a historic landmark. Sarah stepped forward and placed a firm hand on my shoulder. She pointed to the ruined portrait I had brought from the studio. Even without the millions, the land was ours and the truth was out. The tapes would ensure Benedict stayed behind bars for a very long time. We didn't need the grandfather's blood money to start over. We only needed the courage to stand in the light. I felt a flicker of hope. The war was won. Despite the cost, the sun began to rise over the humid marshlands. I walked out to the carriage house and picked up my brushes. The red paint on the floor was a permanent stain I would keep. It was a reminder that love is often an alibi for control. I started a new canvas, one without shadows or secrets. Elena began to hang the first signs for the new residents. We were building something real. Then, my phone buzzed with an unknown number. I pressed it to my ear, and through the static of a long-distance connection, I heard my mother's voice. She wasn't asking for forgiveness. She was asking for the secondary key, the one that unlocked the offshore accounts, hidden in the vault's final ledger.